So good afternoon, first of all. My name is Paula Hunt, and although I am Portuguese, I am not here to speak to you about Portugal. I was asked to speak to you and bring you some examples from countries that are engaging in resource allocation for inclusive education in intentional and purposeful ways to directly respond to their most immediate challenges. So I ask you that for the next 20 minutes or so, you keep an open mind and you consider how the examples that I am going to show you might bring a new light to the similar obstacles that have been found in Italy, Spain, and Portugal through the course of this project. It is always really important for me in situations such as webinars and presentations and conferences um, to ensure that there is actually clarity of language and that we all understand what it is that we are talking about from the very beginning. I am often told that inclusive education means many things to different people. And this way of thinking about an inclusive education definition actually allows for inclusive education to be understood as everything from meaningful systemic reform to something as simple as providing access to school to a child with a disability. So for the purposes of this presentation and really as the core of the work that I am engaged in, I am defining inclusive education by using the only definition that is legally binding. And that is the definition that is included in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, General Comment number 4, paragraph 11, which states that inclusion involves a process of systemic reform embodying changes and modifications in content, teaching methods, approaches, structures, and strategies in education to overcome barriers with a vision serving to provide all students of the relevant age range with an equitable and participatory learning experience and environments that best responds to the requirements and their preferences. So even though this might not be the way in which the legislation in your country defines inclusive education, it should be if the country in which you are working is a party to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as is the case in the 3 countries in question in this project. And the way in which this definition is important is, well, there are several aspects of it. First, it is legally binding to all countries that have ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Second of all, it takes away the guesswork as to what inclusive education is and is not. So it is not possible for somebody to say, well, you know, what we are doing is inclusive education. It might not be what you are doing, but it still is inclusive education because there are many definitions to inclusive education. And I think that it's important that we understand that, as the 2 previous speakers have mentioned, the ways in which we enact inclusive education have to be contextual and are different from country to country and region to region. But we must have one definition of inclusive education so that we all know what it is that we are talking about, what is the aim or the principle, as Mel has called it, and what it is that we are aiming to do. This definition is included in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but I think that it's important because it goes well beyond persons with disabilities. In fact, if I showed you just the paragraph and I did not tell you where that definition was coming from, you would not be able to tell that that definition was included in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is important because, as the previous speakers have already mentioned, inclusive education is not about children with disabilities. Inclusive education is about all children. Systemic reform, which is the way in which I think about inclusive education and the ways in which I think that we are going to be able to make forward progress. Systemic reform aimed at creating inclusive education systems is not about children with disabilities, and it is not about maintaining the status quo. What that means is that it requires transformation, creativity, innovation. It requires that we keep in mind the principles of universality, planning, and meaningful learning, which just happen to be the principles of universal design for learning. Universal design for learning is based on the principle that every child matters and every child learns differently. In other words, we take all the ways in which children are different from each other and we capitalize on their differences. Universal design for learning does not aim to make all children learn equally. It aims to support every child to learn in the way that matters the most to them. So universal design for learning is the only way in which education can be planned to respond to the needs of a very fast-paced 21st century. Therefore, if systemic reform is to be set on the principles of UDL, as it should be, then resource allocation must also follow the principles of universality, design, which is being intentional and being purposeful, to enable meaningful learning. Before we move on to the country examples, I would like to share with you some key findings from two of the most recent UNESCO Global Education Monitoring reports. These key findings are important because although they are global in nature, they're also Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese specific. The challenges related to enacting inclusive education are the same globally. Italy, Portugal, and Spain are not alone in their struggle to find answers to their country-specific challenges. Interestingly, although we usually acknowledge our global weaknesses, we do not usually look outside of the usual suspects for global solutions. So the Global Education Monitoring Report from 2020 was, the report was specific on inclusion in education. And some of the key findings are findings that we are all very well aware of, but it's never too much to mention. First, identity, background, and ability dictate education opportunities. Second, despite progress, many countries still do not collect, report, or use data on students who are left behind. Third, something that we have all known for a very long time, and as the previous presenters have mentioned, Financing needs to target those most in need. And teachers, teaching materials, and learning environments often ignore the benefits of embracing diversity. The most recent Global Education Monitoring Report 24-25 was on leadership in education. And this was a very interesting production of this report because, contrary to what would be expected, we do not know very much about leadership in education. So 3 key findings I thought are really important to framing this conversation around resources. The first one is that good schools need good school leaders, and this would seem obvious. Effective principals ensure that their schools are safe, healthy, and inclusive. However, as we know, very often school leaders are political appointees that not only have no education background, but they really do not know how to be effective in ensuring that their schools are safe, healthy, and inclusive. The second finding is that effective leadership demands fair hiring practices, trust, and growth opportunities. Professional leaders need preparation and training. Much like teachers, professional leaders need to be teachers first, but they actually also need to be prepared to be able to lead others, especially if that leadership is the type of leadership that includes a larger community. And then school leaders should not be heroes. Sharing leadership builds better schools, and sharing leadership throughout the school creates a collaborative learning environment. And I think that this speaks a little bit to the examples that Mel gave about the clusters and the schools in Portugal. Now, what is missing from this list, but it's also a finding from the 2024-2025 GEM report, is that inclusive education requires school leaders that not only believe in it, but are intentional about moving towards inclusive education, and they can find ways to collectively enact it. So, as with everything else, leadership for inclusive education has to be universal, intentional, purposeful, and meant to enable meaningful learning. And now to some unusual country examples. I am going to take you to Romania, to Mongolia, and to Sierra Leone. And this is where I ask you to keep an open mind as to where we might find some of the solutions to the problems that we face in our schools today. I am going to start with Romania because all 3 countries in this project struggle with how to respond to the very specific issues of the Roma population. In Romania, the strategy on the Romanian government on inclusion of Romanian citizens belonging to the Roma minority for the period of 22-27 follows previously used strategies. It focuses on all areas of life, and in education, it aims to improve access to quality education for Roma students. How do they do that? One of the strategies is by having specific funding for schools that have a majority Roma population. They also use specialized grants, and these have enabled schools to develop individualized programs that meet the unique needs of Roma students, again, contextualizing. And outreach programs are aimed at supporting Roma families by raising awareness about the right to education, but also educating families about the existing support services in the community that can facilitate access to education to Roma students. Their second strategy is related to the allocation of European Union financial resources, and this happens both at the national and at local levels. And these European Union financial resources have been used specifically to target teacher training for instructing Roma students, including encouraging Roma university students to become teachers, developing culturally responsive curricula, again, very much what Simone was just talking about, and also providing additional support services such as tutoring and counseling. In addition to the financial resources, the Romanian Ministry of Education also implemented policies to promote human resources dedicated to Roma inclusion. The first strategy, which has been extremely successful, has been a combination of mediators or liaisons between the Roma community and education institutions that help to bridge the cultural divide and encourage school enrollment. The second one is to encourage Roma teachers, sociologists, community leaders to provide teacher training on inclusive practices that addresses systemic bias. This because the challenges in the enrollment, the achievement of Roma students is not an issue related to education. It is an issue that is reflected in education, but it is actually a much broader societal systemic bias issue. So in Romania, to sum it up, the strategies have been multi-sectoral. There has been a multi-sectoral approach to the challenge of the enrollment and the achievement of the Roma population in Romania. Now I'm bringing you to Mongolia. In Mongolia, the Ministry of Education faces the unique challenge of providing equitable education to its very large nomadic population. And 4 strategies have been enacted to tackle this challenge. First, alternative education models have been put in place. Things like a mobile girl kindergarten that adapt to the seasonal migrations of the herder families. And these mobile kindergartens are run on the principle that education needs to go to the child instead of the child going to education. The second strategy on the alternative education models is to utilize and support non-formal education programs with the use of distance learning methods, such as radio broadcast and distribution of learning materials. These 2 alternative education models are extremely important, especially with the youngest students that actually run the risk of not going to school, or even worse, perhaps even worse, having to be away from their families at a very early age and placed in boarding schools. The Mongolian government has also secured financial investments from international NGOs, from the World Bank, from UNESCO, from UNICEF, from UNDP, to improve the conditions of boarding schools while they are accelerating accessible, interactive online education models. This goes a bit to what the previous two speakers were talking about, especially Mel, this danger of separating children into different types of schools, into special education schools, into institutionalized residential facilities, which are also a type of boarding school. However, when you live thousands of miles away from a school, a boarding school has been one of the solutions found in rural areas. And this is not specific to Mongolia. This is a practice in many countries where there are large populations of rural students away from schools. The danger of boarding schools, of course, is that children are away from their families from a very, very early age. So there has to be a compromise in between improving the conditions of the boarding schools, but at the same time accelerating other models of education. And this was particularly effective during the COVID-19 pandemic. There has also been an increase of the amount of learning and teaching materials in rural schools, as well as an increase in the training of school personnel, which very often are not licensed teachers, and also training of parents in order to be able to support their children's learning at home. This is a bit of what we all saw during the COVID-19 pandemic, with the difference that in Mongolia, this is everyday life. I would even go further to say that this is everyday life to many students that live in remote rural areas in many, many countries across the world, including in Portugal. The government of Mongolia, the interesting part is that they had to take a multifaceted approach to the same problem. And this multifaceted approach includes low-tech, radio broadcasts, high-tech online learning solutions, compromise, boarding schools as a temporary necessary evil. But there is the relentless pursuit of traditional or innovative solutions for a deeply revered cultural challenge. And I think that this is extremely important, that we understand that we are not changing cultures and societies. We have to change the ways in which education reaches children without changing the ways in which children are rooted within their own locations, their families, their societies, and their cultures. And now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Sierra Leone, and I think that many of you are familiar with this example. In Sierra Leone, systemic reform is also called radical inclusion, and it was initially designed to address the gender gap in education. However, with the COVID-19 pandemic, this radical inclusion approach quickly demonstrated that a broader approach was needed. And so the national policy on radical inclusion in schools was born in 2021. It is a last first approach, which I find a very interesting way of saying we are going to look at the most disadvantaged students first. And it aims to eliminate barriers for marginalized groups of children, especially girls, especially pregnant girls and young girls who are both parents and learners, children with disabilities, children in rural and hard-to-reach places, and children from low-income families. The implementation plans envisioned, amongst other things, the development, the financial resources, so twofold, a free quality school education provision, which means that children are provided for free with both the materials and anything that they need to be able to attend school. And there was a removal of school fees. And there's also budget allocations, primarily with financial incentives from international partnerships and donor funding for infrastructure, starting with accessibility, learning materials, and teacher training. The second part of these implementation plans had to do with human resources. So human resources focuses on the identification of students at risk, the learning of inclusive practices, and increasing the number of teachers in underserved areas. In addition, they have created inclusion champions at the school level, and they have also introduced the idea of classroom assistants. What was found was that it requires ongoing monitoring and evaluation, and the measures that I just spoke to you about, some of which were experimental, are now included in the 2023 Basic and Senior Secondary Education Act that aligns and reinforces the radical inclusion policy in education with other radical inclusion policies in different sectors, and it provides a national legal framework. So, as Mel was saying at the beginning, using radical inclusion has the principle as the motor that drives inclusive education forward. Now, I understand that when you look at Sierra Leone, these measures might seem very basic. They might even seem old-fashioned in Portugal, Spain, and Italy. But if you take into consideration that they were enacted in a low resource country, what they have accomplished in 4 years is astounding. And it is not necessarily a matter of financial investment. It was interesting listening to Simone previously, because for me, in all of the years in which I have worked in international development, usually government people, the first thing that they say is, there's no money. And my answer is always, there is money. Because the money needs to be moved from where it has previously been, which is usually in segregated settings, to other settings that are actually leading to more inclusive practices. The themes that run through your project, the key findings from global research, the challenges of the 3 country examples are all the same. They have been the same since we all started on this journey towards systemic reform for inclusive education. And so the takeaways that I would like to invite you to consider are the following. First, you need to act with urgency. Not engaging in intentional and purposeful systemic reform will only serve to maintain the status quo. So you will have the same challenges and no solutions. Collaborate within and across all settings, because you never know where the good ideas are going to come from. You need to tackle the same challenges from various fronts, because one challenge is going to have, more than likely, multiple solutions. And don't be afraid to fail. You have to try and fail. That is what meaningful learning, the third pillar of UDL, is. Meaningful learning does not happen without setbacks. And lastly, data, data, and more data. Data is your friend. You have to measure. Of course, you have to know what it is that you're measuring. And of course, you have to be intentional in your measurement. Of course, you have to measure participation, but you also have to measure money. And you have to know where money is going. You have to know where your financial allocations are actually being allocated, because perhaps that is where you are going to find some of the answers you are looking for. I am going to leave you with the very simple words from Dr. David Sengay, who was the proportioner to radical inclusion. He says, when we build solutions in normal times, we're not usually leading with inclusion. We're not thinking about everyone. But in an emergency, solutions must include all people, because everyone is vulnerable. The key lesson is that solutions should work for everyone. The slides have some of the resources that were used in this presentation. Many other resources are available. And of course, I am always happy to discuss with you not only what I have shared with you here, but also ideas and examples from far and wide. So thank you very much for your attention. Diane?